Hello, learner. Welcome to Mr. Quakers Teachers. I'm Mr. Quakers. In this lesson, I'll be analyzing Musaemura's Zimunya's poem, A Long Journey. Now, this poem is part of the 15 poems for your GCSE or IGCSE anthology, and it's part of a course in which I've analyzed all the 15 poems with sample A-star quality essays that you can mimic your writing with, and also predicted questions or as well for each of the poems, so that when you study the poem or you listen to the analysis of the poem, you can try hands on it. Now, additionally, there's a video here that explains all the form and structure, themes, point of view of all the 15 poems as well, and also sample essays on how to write essays. I teach you paragraph by paragraph what to do in the essays. Now, additionally, if you need help with tuition with any other of the components, the prose, the drama, the unseen paper, or even the poetry, you can join our group sessions or a one-on-one session. The lesson or the first lesson is a free lesson, so it's a trial lesson with no obligations. If you join the lesson, you like the feel of it and you think it's something that will be helpful to you to prepare you for the exam, you can stick and stay. If not, you can just look for other options without any questions asked. Now, additionally, we have teachers, very experienced teachers that can help prepare you for your exams. So in the sciences, in English, in math, in geography, history, sociology, all the subjects, we have teachers with multiple decades of experience who can help prepare you for the exam, build your confidence to make sure that you get the grade that you want to get. Let's begin the analysis. Now, let's begin by speaking about the poet Musaemura Zimunya. He was born in 1949 in Mutare in southern Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. He was educated in Rhodesia and then at Kent University in the UK, where he acquired an MA in literature in 1979. After independence in 1980, he joined the University of Zimbabwe as a literature teacher. He left in 1999 for the USA. Zimunya began publishing poems when he was still at school in literary journals in Rhodesia. His early poetry often revealed an imaginative appreciation of the beauty of nature, while his collection Thought Tracks, which was published by Longman in 1982, represents a generation that felt marginalized and designated by colonialism. Kingfisher, Jikanya, and other poems published in the same year by Longman in 1982 is a celebration of love and nature. So that's just like a brief note on the poet. Now, this is how the poem appears in your anthology. It's going to be a bit broader, but I just wanted you to see how the entirety of the poem appears on the page. Observe that it has like 30 lines, in total, in terms of the number of lines in the poem. Now, in terms of the summary of the poem is recounted by this, rural urban migrant someone who used to live in the rural area, but then he's moved to the urban area, who is speaking about, the things, the superstition and beliefs and other things that drag him back, both mentally and in a way physically, from the city where life has a bit more amenities to the rural area where things are a bit more simple, and very ordinary essentially. So that's a summary of the poem. Let me begin my analysis by reading the poem A Long Journey by Musaemura Zimunya. Through decades that ran like rivers, endless rivers of endless woes, through pick and shovel, shambok and jail. Oh, such a long, long journey. When the motor car came, the sledge and the horse cart began to die. But for a while, the bicycle made in Britain was the dream of every village boy. With the arrival of the bus, the city was brought into the village, and we began to yearn for the place beyond the horizons. Such a long travel it was, a long journey from bush to concrete. And now I'm haunted by the cave dwelling hidden behind 1890. threatening my newfound luxury in this, the capital of my mother country. I fight in nightmarish vain, but my road runs and turns into dusty gravel, into overbeaten foot tracks that lead to a plastic hut, and soon to the mud grass dwelling, threatened by wind and rain and cold. We fled from witches and wizards on a long, long road to the city, but behind the halo of tower lights, I hear the cry from human blood and wicked bones rattling around me. We moved into the lights, but from the dark periphery behind, an almighty hand reaches for our shirts. Now, the first thing I want us to look at is how the poem opens in the first stanza. We see the blend of personification and simile. So, through decades that run like rivers, decades is used there as an allusion to personified time. So, time is personified, and it's personified by the use of the word run, right? So, the verb run personifies decades or time and provides vivid visual imagery of the speed with which it ran. So, essentially, the speaker is telling us that time runs very quickly, but personified time is like it's extremely fast. The simile, through decades that, like rivers, powerfully communicates the fluid, ceaseless, easy, and unhindered flow of personified time. So observe that time is personified in a sense, to show how, and likened to a river, to show how quickly it runs or it flows. Now, in the simile, through decades that, like rivers, and then decades is likened to rivers. So endless rivers equals endless decades. So you observe that, right? You see that endless rivers equals endless decades. So it's almost like it's interchangeable, essentially. Now, we also observe the use of repetition as well in the first two lines of the poem. So the word rivers and the word endless is repeated multiple times. So in lines 1 and 2, which likens decades to emphasize the many years. So many years has passed. That's why the word decades and the word endless is repeated, and also the word rivers is also repeated as well to emphasize the unceasing nature of the experience. The experience never ends, and it's continuous. Now, endless woes is an allusion or sort of like an indirect reference to the intense and long-drawn suffering or sorrow that the speaker's people have experienced. That's what it means by endless woes. Now, observe that the speaker also, or the poet also uses anaphora as well. So the word through is repeated in the first line of the first stanza and then the third line of the first stanza as well. That is repeated to emphasize and communicate the difficult and the very protracted nature of their experience to the reader. It was very, very difficult and protracted. It was long drawn, essentially. Then the speaker uses listing. So he uses listing and repetition in line 3. So the poetic voice lists 4 things in the third line of the stanza. So pick. Now that is used to selectively dislodge a rock from a rock face. So you're going to see that mining is like the key or the main job that is done here. Then shovel. So that's also a tool for digging. Then shambok. Now shambok, I think, is a reference to the whip that is usually made of hide that is used to lash. So I suspect that the speaker is trying to present that even though they were miners and they were working in the mines, there were portions or there were times when they were beaten or whipped, like slaves essentially. Then he ends the line with jail, the word jail. So essentially it means that some people were even imprisoned. Now observe that the mention of shovel and shambok together, there's no and between both words. And I think the speaker does this to create the impression that they were used together. In each other's kettle, they were used very closely. So even though people were working with their picks and shovel, they were beaten and sometimes jailed. And that shows that these people were oppressed people. He ends the first stanza with, the word, oh, such a long, long journey. But observe that the word and is repeated twice in the third line of the stanza. So it's repeated in line 3 as the speaker lists to emphasize the connection between mining, torture, and imprisonment. So people were tortured. People, even though they were mining itself is a very physically intensive and demanding work. But even with that, they were being tortured and imprisoned. When he says, "Oh," that's an exclamation that provides vivid auditory imagery of the speaker's scream of exasperation, of tiredness, of pain, essentially. Then we see that the repetition of the word "long" twice in the fourth line of that stanza. So it says, "Long in such the twice repetition of long in such a long journey emphasizes the extreme difficulty of the journey that he and presumably his people and previous generation have had to endure. So it was arduous and difficult, both physically and mentally. In the second stanza of the poem, we see the use of personification, and that is seen when it says, "When the motor car came." So the verb "came" personifies the motor car and creates the impression that it walked into the town majestically. But then, in the literal meaning of the line is that it's a reference or allusion to the introduction of motor-driven cars with internal combustion engines and the mechanization of mining. That's a shift. So from very physical work, there was introduction of motor car mechanization to make the mining a bit easier. And I presume that would have caused multiple people to lose their jobs. And we're going to see in the bit that people sort of moved or people traveled. Then he continues and adds that the sledge and the horse cart began to die. So the very basic way of mining was no longer tenable. I'm sure multiple people were made redundant. Now there's a third personification. The sledge and the horse cart began to die. No, now the verb "began to die" personifies the sledge and the horse cart and presents the motor car as a kryptonite whose presence started to the slow deaths of the sledge and then the horse cart. So the sledge is like something that is connected to the horse cart and then it's dragged. But now the motor car has come. It's a bit faster with an engine. Now, in terms of the literal meaning, right, the first bit is the figurative meaning, but then I'll say that you stick more with the figurative meaning than the literal meaning. But in the literal sense, the sledge is a vehicle on runners used for transporting mineral ore, while the horse cart is a cart pulled by an oxen. Began to die means that they became redundant by technology, essentially. So we see that technology caused some of the things that were used in the mining to become redundant. And so by extension, people would have lost their jobs. Then we see the theme of pursuit of status. Remember, most of these people are around this point, that the stanzas 1 and 2. He's talking about what's happening in the rural setting. Then he says pursuit of status in terms of the theme. But for a while, the bicycle made in Britain was the dream of every village boy. So observe that he reveals the period that all the village boys, in that time, which is quite self-depreciating, because he appears to be speaking down on who he is and then the identity of the rest of the people in the village. So it's a self-depreciating description. Now, wanted bicycles that were made in Britain because they gave them prestige and respect. So think of it. These people are living in the rural setting. They are working very hard in the mines. And then suddenly there's introduction of bicycles. And everybody wants one. The one that is made in Britain, because it's a status symbol. So you see here that as they are beginning to mess with the minds of the village boys, they are beginning to be very, very attached to, property. In the first stanza, we see the fourth personification. So the verb arrival personifies the bus. Now, the bus is important because it introduces transportation to the village. And so instead of maybe walking for long periods to the city, people can now be transported. So the verb arrival personifies the bus and creates the impression that it walked majestically into the city, just like the motor car. Right? While the city was brought into the village, provides vivid visual imagery of the large city, which presumably was very mysterious and foreign to the rural dwellers, being reduced in size and being transported to the village. So even though they were living in the village, they now had experience of city living. And we are going to see what happens in line 11, or the last line of the first stanza, because we're told that, and we began to yearn for a place beyond the horizons. So with the introduction of transportation through buses, people in the rural setting began to say, well, I think I'm going to move to the city. That's what we see and we began to yearn. Yearn means that they had reveals an intense and palpable aspiration of all the village folks, possibly male and female, to find out more about the city. After they experienced bits of it, maybe somebody brought something from the city and this person brought something from the city, and they're like, oh, I would want to go to the city. Now, beyond the horizons is a metaphorical reference or allusion to the places beyond the limits of their geography or experience. That's beyond what they've experienced previously. So the urban area, they want to go to the urban area. Everybody wants to go to the urban area. Everybody wants to be a city boy or a city girl. Now observe that the speaker uses the word we in line 11. Previously he's talked about the village, but now he says we. That tells you that there were multiple people who had similar or the same desire to travel. So it was like something that ran through the entirety of the rural setting or the village. Now, in terms of the themes of the poem, we have rural-urban migration, superstition, history, identity, primitive, semi-modernity, and then modernity, among other themes. Those are like the key themes I've seen. I mean, you can think about other themes as well. Then, in terms of the tone, the poem is quite narrative. It's like this speaker is narrating his life and the life of his people, the history of his people to the reader. It's also very honest. He's very open, but there's this sense of fatigue or tiredness and fear even, towards the end, where this almighty hand reaches for their shirts, trying to drag them back. Now, in terms of the point of view of the poem is recounted with a blend of the first person singular, plural points of view, as the speaker speaks about his personal and then the collective experience of his fellow rural urban migrants. So these are people who have moved from maybe possibly rural villages to Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. So you see the repetition of I, my, I, me. Then when he wants to talk about the collective experience of he and his fellow rural urban migrants, he uses the first person, plural pronoun we. So it's something that everybody experiences. Now, in terms of the form and the structure, and I tell my students it's important to speak about the form and the structure of a poem. You have to write it in your essays, and I advise students to write it in the final, the last but one paragraph just before the conclusion. And if you look at the sample A-star essay that's part of the course, you see how I present it. Now, the poem is a free-verse poem. And we see that in the lack of rhyme scheme in the poem. I think the poet does it to show that their life is unrhythmic. Their lives has like this topsy-turvy feel to it. It is unpredictable. It's arduous and difficult because they are living in the city that has all the amenities, but they have to contend with their history and where they are from. The poem is 30 lines in total, but then it's broken into 7 stanzas of varying lengths. You see, so we see couplets. So 2-line stanzas, and we see 3-line stanzas, and then also when you say the 2-line stanzas, that's stanza 4, right? That's a 2-line stanza. Then when we say tacet or 3-line stanzas, that's stanza 3 and stanza 7. Then we also have quatrain stanzas as well. That's 4-line stanzas. So that's stanza 1 and stanza 2. So you see they have 4 lines. Then we have quintet or 5-line stanzas. That's stanza 6. Then we also have a nonet or 9-line stanza. That's stanza 5. And that's like the longest stanza, I think. And that's very important because you see in that stanza he speaks about their experience in the city. And how the village and then their history sort of dragging them back, and then when they go there it's a very, very difficult living. I think he says that to show that when you've experienced modernity, sometimes it's very, very difficult to go back and then live a very, very humble life. The poet also employs enjambment as well, multiple times in the poem, seeing the flow of words from one line to the next and then from stanza to stanza. So if you observe, the poem only has one full stop. So from stanza 1 to stanza 6, there's no full stop. The only stanza with a full stop is the final stanza. And I think the poet does this to mimic the long journey that he traveled. The unending journey that he traveled that never ceased. So that is about it in terms of the structure. So you can write that about the structure, and then that will be well done. So please look at the predicted question for this essay and then try your hands on it. So here you have it. Musaemura's Zimunya's A Long Journey has been made simple. Like I said in the opening, this analysis is part of a course that contains all 15 poems, and it sells for only £5 a month for subscription, or you can buy the entirety of the course for £45 a year. That means you get to save 3 months in subscription. Now, additionally, there are predicted questions for each of the poems. So when you listen to the analysis, you can try your hands on it. Additionally, there are sample A-star or grade 9 essays that you can look at and then mimic or build your other essays around. Additionally, if you need help with other of the subjects, other subjects, sciences, math, English, sociology, history, geography, just sign up. You can sign up for our group sessions or our one-on-one session. The first session is a free session. It's a trial lesson. So you can just join the lesson. If you enjoy the way the lesson played out, or you enjoyed how it manifested, then you can stick and stay and then maybe book multiple lessons as you prepare for the exam. If not, without any question asked, you can look for other options. Now, if you need to reach me for any inquiries or any questions, you can send me an email at mrq@mrquakersteaches.com. mrq@mrquakersteaches.com, or you can send me a question at mrquakersteaches@gmail.com, or you can write in the comments field of this thing, and then I'll reach out to you and then we'll see how best to help you as prepare for your exams. Now, thank you so much for joining this analysis. Until next time, from me, Mr. Quakers. Bye-bye.